Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive into the world of sociology.
Yeah, we're gonna be like diving deep today.
It's going to be deep.
It's deep.
Sociology, have you ever felt like sometimes you're just like swimming in all these social interactions and like trends and these structures that you don't really understand? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, we're gonna try to make sense of it all today.
Yes, we are.
Using some pretty awesome sources too.
Yes.
We've got excerpts from a sociology textbook,
Yeah.
an intro to women, gender, and sexuality studies textbook, and even some videos that just break down like the fundamentals of sociology.
Yes, and we are going to be focusing on three major sociological perspectives.
Yes.
Functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism.
Big three.
Yes, the big three. We're going to use them to dissect a very complex issue.
Yes.
Poverty.
Uh-huh.
So think of it like we're putting on three different pairs of glasses.
Okay.
Each one is going to give us a different view of this same problem.
Precisely. Yeah. And before we get into those perspectives, though, I think it's important to just establish like a baseline understanding of what sociology even is.
Okay.
So at its core, it's really the study of society and how individuals interact within it.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's really about trying to understand these patterns and structures that shape our lives,
Okay.
even the ones that we just take completely for granted. So
Right.
think about family dinners,
Okay.
going to school,
Yeah.
or even the meaning behind symbols like a wedding ring.
Okay, so it's not just like big abstract ideas. It's really about understanding the social forces behind everyday things.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, and one of the key things that sociologists do is analyze these things at different levels.
Okay.
So we call this microsociology and macrosociology.
Ooh, okay, break those down for me.
Okay, so imagine you're at a party.
Okay, I like parties.
Yeah, a microsociologist might be the person there that's kind of zooming in on the small interactions.
Yeah.
So they're paying attention to like how people are forming these little groups.
Okay.
You know what their body language is like.
Uh-huh.
Maybe picking up on these subtle cues in the conversation.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're really looking at that individual behavior within that specific social setting.
Okay, so they're like social detectives.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
So they're focused on like the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about macrosociology then?
Yeah, so the macro-sociologists at that same party, they might be taking a step back.
Okay.
They're thinking more about how this party reflects these like broader societal trends.
Okay.
So maybe they're thinking about class dynamics or economic disparities, or even just how gender roles are playing out in those interactions.
Okay, so they're looking at the bigger picture.
Yes.
How all those individual interactions fit into like the larger societal puzzle. Exactly. And it's so easy to get caught up in one level and miss the other one.
Yeah.
So we might focus on these individual choices without realizing how much those choices are actually constrained by these larger social forces at play.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get so focused on like these small details, I forget to zoom out and look at the whole picture. It's kind of like if you're trying to understand a forest, but you're just looking at one tree.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this leads us to another super important concept.
Okay.
Social constructionism.
Okay.
Have you heard of that before?
I have, but I'm still a little fuzzy on it.
Yeah, so basically it challenges this idea that things like gender, race, and sexuality are purely natural or biological. Instead, it argues that these categories are actually created and given meaning by society.
Can you give me an example?
Absolutely. So let's take the term heterosexuality.
Okay.
Our sources point out that this term didn't even exist until the late 19th century.
Really?
I know. And get this, it originally referred to someone who was attracted to both sexes. A&D was engaging in sex for pleasure.
Wait, really? That is so different from how we understand it today.
Right. But at the time, it was actually considered deviant.
Interesting.
Yeah, because sex was supposed to be solely for reproduction.
Wow.
So it just shows you how meanings can change so drastically over time and across cultures.
It really highlights how power dynamics play a role in shaping what becomes normal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about how institutions that are controlled by those in power, let's say the 1%,
Yeah.
they often reinforce the values of the dominant culture.
Right.
And those values then become embedded in our social structures.
Okay, so before we dive into how those structures impact poverty, let's take a closer look at those three sociological perspectives that we mentioned before.
Okay.
First up, functionalism.
Okay, so functionalists, they view society as this complex system.
Okay.
where all the parts work together to maintain stability.
Okay.
So like a well-oiled machine,
Yeah.
or even a human body. Each part has its own function that contributes to the whole.
Okay.
So institutions like government, education, family,
Okay.
they all have these roles that are designed to keep society running smoothly.
That makes sense, but I have to admit, when it comes to poverty, it's hard to see how that fits into that well-oiled machine analogy.
Yeah, I can understand that, but functionalists might argue that even poverty,
Okay.
despite all of its negative consequences, can actually serve positive functions for society as a whole.
Really?
I know it sounds counterintuitive, right?
Definitely. I'm curious how they would justify that.
Okay, so sociologist Herbert Gans explored this idea
Okay.
in his article, The Positive Functions of the Undeserving Poor.
Interesting.
So he argued that poverty creates jobs in
Right.
social work, law enforcement, and other sectors that are dealing with its consequences.
Right.
It also provides a scapegoat for societal problems.
Well,
So instead of addressing these systemic issues like
Right.
lack of access to education or healthcare, people in power can just blame poverty on the individuals that are experiencing it.
So it's a way of maintaining the status quo
Mhm.
and avoiding any real systemic change.
Exactly. And of course, functionalism has been criticized for focusing too much on stability
Right.
and not adequately explaining social change,
Yeah.
because societies are constantly evolving and conflict is often that catalyst for change.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next perspective then. Conflict theory.
Okay.
Tell me more about that one.
So conflict theory is all about power dynamics and inequality.
Okay.
It's rooted in the work of Karl Marx,
Uh-huh.
who saw society as divided between those who own the means of production,
Okay.
the capitalists, and those who sell their labor.
The workers.
The worker, exactly. And he believed that this fundamental conflict is what drives social change.
So looking at poverty through this lens, we would see it as a result of this inherent power imbalance.
Exactly. And we can see this playing out today with the rise of neoliberalism,
Right.
which prioritizes free market capitalism
Uh-huh.
and often results in policies like privatization and deregulation.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture, we can see how these policies have contributed to rising economic inequality.
Exactly.
Wages are stagnating while corporate profits are soaring.
Exactly. It raises the question, who benefits from this system
Right.
and who gets left behind?
Yeah, that question feels especially relevant right now.
Yeah.
This brings us to our final perspective for today.
Yes.
Symbolic interactionism.
Okay.
It seems like this one offers a way to understand how poverty is actually experienced on a personal level.
Yes, you got it.
Okay.
So this perspective really zooms in on how meaning is created through those everyday interactions,
Sure.
often through symbols.
So less about the big systems and more about the individual stories.
Exactly. So for example, Barbara Ehrenreich's book,
Okay.
Nickel and Dimed, provides a really powerful illustration of how poverty shapes those individual lives.
I've heard of that book.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't she go undercover and work minimum wage jobs to see if she could actually survive?
That's right. Wow.
Yeah. And her experience showed just how incredibly difficult it is to make ends meet
Yeah.
and how poverty can trap people in this cycle of despair.
It's one thing to read the statistics about poverty, but it's another to hear about someone's lived experience.
That
I
is
mean,
a-
it makes it so much more real and impactful.
For sure. And another sociologist, Jennifer Sherman, she studied the symbolic distinctions between the working poor and those receiving aid.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she found that even within impoverished communities, there are these hierarchies and judgments
Mm-hmm.
based on how people perceive different types of work.
Okay.
So someone working a minimum wage job might look down on someone who's receiving government assistance,
Right.
even though they're both struggling financially.
Wow. It's fascinating how those social constructs and symbolic meanings can perpetuate these divisions even within marginalized groups.
Yeah.
It's not just about material conditions, it's about perceptions and social status.
Exactly. So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. From the macro to the micro, from abstract concepts to personal stories.
Uh-huh.
So what are your initial thoughts on these three different lenses for understanding poverty?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm curious. What
Yeah.
are you thinking?
Wow. I'm already feeling like I have a much deeper understanding of poverty, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, it really is fascinating.
Each perspective is like a different piece of the puzzle,
Yeah,
you know?
it is.
It reveals another layer of complexity.
Yeah, for sure. And there's another piece of the puzzle that we need to explore.
Okay.
Institutions.
Okay.
They play a huge role in shaping our lives and how we experience the world.
Okay, so when we talk about institutions, we're talking about things like family education, government religion, even the media. All those are examples.
Yes, think of them as these established and enduring patterns of social behavior.
Okay.
They provide a framework for how we interact and organize ourselves as a society.
Okay.
They have these established rules and norms and values that guide our behavior.
And they can be incredibly powerful forces in our lives.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, they shape our beliefs, our values, our opportunities, pretty much everything.
You're absolutely right. They can even impact our life chances.
Really?
Yeah. Take the educational system, for example.
Okay.
It's not just about learning facts and figures.
Right.
It's also about socialization.
Uh-huh.
It's about preparing us for the workforce.
Yeah.
And even reinforcing certain cultural values.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces connect.
Yeah.
We talked about social constructionism earlier and how power dynamics shape what we consider normal.
Right.
Institutions seem to play a big role in that too, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So depending on where you live
Yeah.
and your socioeconomic status, you might have access to very different educational opportunities.
Right.
And that can have a ripple effect on your entire life.
Yeah.
So that's why sociologists are so interested in understanding how institutions both reflect and perpetuate existing social inequalities.
So it's not just about the institutions themselves. It's about who has access to them and how that access or lack of access is distributed.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to the concept of culture,
Okay.
which we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Remember, culture is that system of symbols, values, practices, and interests of a group of people.
Right.
And ideology plays a big role in shaping that culture.
Uh-huh.
It's that set of ideas and beliefs that justify the power of the dominant group.
Right, like the example we talked about earlier with the 1%.
Exactly.
A small group can have a huge influence over cultural norms and values.
Exactly. It's like this feedback loop.
Okay.
Institutions are shaped by culture, and in turn, they help reproduce those cultural norms and values.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Great.
But could we make this a little more concrete?
Sure.
Like, what's an example of how this plays out in real life?
Okay, well, think about the media, for instance.
Okay.
It's a very powerful institution that shapes our perceptions of the world, often reinforcing existing stereotypes and power dynamics.
So the media we consume, news, movies, TV shows, they're not just entertainment.
Right.
They're actually shaping how we view the world and understand different groups of people. It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is, and it's why it's so important to be these critical consumers of media,
Okay.
to be aware of those underlying messages and biases that might be present.
Right.
We need to develop our own sociological lenses to see through those biases and understand the bigger picture.
Okay, so how do our three perspectives view institutions?
Okay.
Let's start with functionalism.
Okay, so functionalists, they see institutions as essential for maintaining social order and stability.
Okay.
They believe that each institution serves this specific function that contributes to the overall well-being of society.
So in their view, the family provides emotional support and socialization.
Uh-huh.
Education prepares individuals for the workforce.
Yes.
The government maintains law and order. It's all about maintaining balance.
Exactly. But as you might guess, conflict theorists have a different take.
Yeah. Okay.
They argue that institutions often serve the interests of the powerful at the expense of the less powerful.
Okay, that makes sense. They'd probably point to the fact that the wealthy have more influence over government policies,
Right.
or that education systems often reproduce class inequalities,
Mm-hmm.
or even that the media can be used to manipulate public opinion.
You're getting it.
Okay.
And what about symbolic interactionism?
Yeah.
How do you think they might approach institutions?
Well, based on what we've talked about, I guess they'd focus on how individuals experience and interact within institutions.
Exactly. So they might study how students navigate the social hierarchies of a school,
Okay.
or how patients interact with doctors and nurses in a hospital, or even how families negotiate gender roles and power dynamics.
It's amazing how each perspective gives us a different angle on the same thing.
Yeah,
It's like each one is illuminating a different part of the stage.
I love that.
And together, they give us a more complete picture.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It highlights the importance of considering all three perspectives to develop that more holistic understanding of these complex social structures.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, it's a little overwhelming, too.
Yeah.
It's like suddenly seeing all the strings behind the curtain,
Yeah.
you know? All
Yeah.
the hidden forces that shape our lives.
It can be a lot to take in, but that's the beauty of sociology.
Okay.
It helps us see the familiar in a new light
Uh-huh.
and uncover these hidden meanings and power dynamics that shape our everyday lives.
Yeah.
It's about developing that critical awareness of the social forces at play
Right.
and recognizing our own agency within those structures.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how my own experiences with institutions like my family school and even the media I consume have shaped my worldview.
That's a great insight.
Yeah.
We're all products of our social environment,
Right.
but that doesn't mean we're powerless to change it.
Okay, so where do we go from here? How do we apply these sociological insights to create a more just and equitable society? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
We've uncovered all these complex systems and structures, but how do we actually use this knowledge to make a difference?
Yeah, it's a question that sociologists grapple with all the time.
Right.
But I think the first step is just awareness.
Okay.
Understanding how power operates, how institutions function, and how those social structures we talked about can perpetuate these inequalities.
Yeah.
So once we see the problem, clearly we can start to envision solutions.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's a bit daunting too, right? I mean, these structures seem so big, so ingrained. It's hard to imagine how we as individuals can really make a dent in them.
Yeah, you're right. It's not easy. But remember, social structures aren't fixed. They're not immutable.
Okay.
They can be challenged and changed. It takes collective action.
Okay.
Social movements, people coming together to demand a more just and equitable society.
So those movements, like the civil rights movement or the feminist movements, they're proof that change possible, that these structures can be dismantled.
Exactly. Those movements were successful because they challenged those dominant narratives.
Right.
They exposed the injustices that were embedded in these institutions, and they mobilized people to demand change.
Yeah.
They showed that even the most deeply rooted inequalities can be overcome with enough collective will.
That's inspiring.
It is.
And that's where sociology comes in, right?
Yeah,
Gives us the tools to analyze these structures,
All right.
understand how they operate, and identify those pressure points where change can happen.
Precisely. It's like a roadmap for social change.
I like that.
By understanding those root causes of social problems, we can start to develop much more effective strategies for addressing them.
So it's not just about studying society, it's about using that knowledge to create positive change.
You got it. And that brings us back to our three perspectives.
Okay.
And how they might approach social change.
Okay, let's break that down. Functionalists, with their emphasis on stability and balance, what would they suggest?
Okay, so they might advocate for those incremental reforms
Okay.
to address any dysfunctions within the system. So policies that promote social integration and reduce inequalities.
Okay.
But they wouldn't necessarily advocate for completely overhauling that existing power structure.
More of a tweaking approach then.
Yeah, exactly. What about conflict theorists?
Yeah.
Their view seems much more radical.
Yeah, it does.
Definitely, they would likely call for a more fundamental transformation.
Okay.
So redistribution of wealth and power,
Okay.
dismantling oppressive institutions, and even a shift in those cultural values.
Okay.
They see that conflict as the engine of social change.
That's a pretty different approach.
It is.
What about symbolic interactionists?
Okay.
Where do they fit in?
So they probably focus on changing individual attitudes and behaviors.
Okay.
So they might work to raise awareness about social issues,
Uh-huh.
challenge stereotypes and prejudices,
Right.
and promote empathy and understanding across these different groups.
Okay.
They believe that change starts with individuals changing their perceptions and interactions.
So each perspective offers like a different path towards social change.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they all share that same goal of creating a more just and equitable society.
That's right. It's like we're all climbing the same mountain,
Yeah.
but we're taking different routes to get to the top.
That's a great way to put it. Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been eye-opening.
Good.
I feel like I have a whole new set of lenses for looking at the world.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, sociology isn't just this academic subject.
Yeah.
It's a way of seeing the world. It's a lens that helps us make sense of our own experiences and the experiences of others. It's about asking the right questions, challenging assumptions, and never taking anything for granted.
And using that knowledge to create a more just world for everyone.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
we want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay, yeah.
Now that you've dipped your toes into the world of sociology,
Yeah.
what social issue are you curious to explore further through these different lenses?
What sparks your passion? What systems or structures do you want to see change? We encourage you to keep thinking critically about the world around you, to keep asking those questions, and to never stop seeking answers. Because the more we understand about society, the better equipped we are to create that positive change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep exploring.